Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back into the soft shadows of history. So if you're lying down, you can close your eyes. And if you're sitting up, maybe you can loosen your shoulders, unclench your jaw, and let yourself sink into that pleasantly sleepy state where history feels less like a lecture and more like a low, strange lullaby. And for tonight's story, we'll be floating through a rather sad but oddly fascinating question: what happened to the children of executed queens? Because as it turns out, when a royal mother lost her head, quite literally, her children didn't exactly skip off to a wholesome foster home. Their lives usually dissolved into a series of political calculations, awkward guardianships, and sometimes quiet disappearances. It's not the kind of bedtime story you'd read to a child. But for drifting into sleep, it works nicely. Let's begin gently, with a name you've probably heard before. Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII. Executed in May of 1536 after what can only be described as one of the least convincing show trials in European history. She was accused of adultery, witchcraft, and, for good measure, sleeping with her own brother. Because naturally, if you're going to invent charges, you might as well check all the boxes. At the time of Anne's downfall, her daughter Elizabeth was just 2.5 years old. Too young to know much about treason. Too young to remember the glittering court where her mother had once reigned. But just old enough to be punished for her mother's supposed crimes. The morning after Anne's execution, Elizabeth was stripped of her royal title. No longer Princess Elizabeth. She was demoted to the Lady Elizabeth, and her household was quietly downsized, fewer attendants, less ceremony, and no guarantee that she would even remain in favor with her increasingly unpredictable father. For years, Elizabeth drifted in this strange limbo. Half disgraced, half forgotten. Raised in the countryside by governesses who were careful to keep her educated but never too visible. Because with Henry VIII, visibility could get you killed. If you smiled too brightly, or seemed too clever, you might suddenly look like a threat. And yet, the daughter of a beheaded mother somehow outlived every other Tudor sibling. Elizabeth grew up shrewd, careful, and just paranoid enough to survive the minefield of Tudor politics. She would, of course, return to the throne as Queen Elizabeth I, a ruler so famous that people now forget she was once the neglected child of an executed queen. But not all royal children had such convenient narrative arcs. Some ended less like future Gloriana, and more like forgotten footnote. Mary, Queen of Scots, and Little James. Let's drift a few decades forward. Mary, Queen of Scots. An unfortunate woman with an extraordinary ability to marry the wrong men. Her disastrous husbands included a weakling who was murdered, a possible murderer who was later blown up, and finally, a cousin with all the charisma of a sack of turnips. Mary's life ended in 1587 with her execution in England, where Elizabeth I, yes, the same Elizabeth we just talked about, ordered her cousin's head removed in a rather messy scene at Fotheringhay Castle. But by then, Mary already had a son, James. And unlike Anne Boleyn's daughter, James was not left in obscurity. He was, in fact, carefully protected. Why? Because the Scottish lords had seen enough of Mary's chaotic personal life, and they wanted a king who wouldn't immediately run the country into the ground. So little James was taken from his mother when he was still a baby. He grew up surrounded not by affection but by stern Calvinist tutors who lectured him on the evils of women. A rather awkward message for a child whose mother was alive, imprisoned, and occasionally sending him embroidered shirts as a reminder of her existence. When Mary was executed, James didn't even protest. He was pragmatic, even as a teenager. And perhaps he knew that mourning too loudly for his mother could derail his ambitions. So instead, he bided his time. Eventually, when Elizabeth I died childless in 1603, James took the English throne. He became James I of England. And the dynasty continued, but the bond between mother and son had long been severed, sacrificed to politics. Catherine Howard's ghostly daughters or lack thereof. Now, let's step back to Henry VIII's court for a moment. Because Catherine Howard, wife number 5, in case you're counting, was another young queen who ended with her head on the block. Unlike Anne Boleyn, however, Catherine never had children. She barely had time. She was a teenager, probably around 17 or 18, when she married the 50-year-old Henry. And she was dead within 2 years, executed in 1542 after being accused of adultery. So in Catherine's case, there were no royal infants to worry about. But it's worth pausing here, because the absence of children was itself part of the tragedy. Queens were meant to secure dynasties by producing heirs. When they didn't, whether by bad luck, bad health, or bad timing, their position became dangerously fragile. A childless queen was easy to discard. And sometimes, as with Catherine, the price was blood. Lady Jane Grey's shadowed sisters. We can't talk about doomed royal mothers without drifting over to Lady Jane Grey. Known as the 9 Days Queen. Technically, she wasn't executed for being a queen consort. She was executed for being a queen herself. A pawn placed on the throne in 1553, then swiftly removed by Mary Tudor, who had a far stronger claim. Jane was just 16 or 17 when she was beheaded. And she never had children of her own. But what's interesting is what happened to her sisters. They weren't executed, but their lives were shaped entirely by Jane's fate. Catherine Grey, the younger sister, inherited Jane's role as possible Tudor backup heir. This was not a fun position to hold. Elizabeth I, famously paranoid, watched her with deep suspicion. When Catherine secretly married without royal permission, Elizabeth locked her in the Tower of London. Catherine's children were declared illegitimate. She eventually died in custody, of tuberculosis. Not executed, but not exactly free either. So here we see another pattern. Sometimes, the children didn't even need to exist yet. The mere possibility of children, the idea that a woman might give birth to rival heirs, was enough to destroy lives. Marie Antoinette and her surviving children. Now let's drift forward to France. To Versailles, powdered wigs, and cake that may or may not have existed. Marie Antoinette, the doomed Queen of France, executed in 1793. Her husband, Louis XVI, had already been guillotined earlier that year. Together, they left behind 4 children. And what happened to those children was a mixture of sad, grim, and briefly hopeful. The eldest daughter, Marie-Therese, was the only one who truly survived the revolution. She spent years imprisoned in the Temple, a grim stone fortress in Paris, before being released and exiled. She grew up severe and joyless, the kind of person who had learned early that laughter might attract too much attention. She lived to adulthood, married, and technically became the titular Queen of France in exile. But she never had children. Possibly because the trauma had drained every ounce of softness from her life. Her younger brother, the so-called Louis XVII, was less fortunate. He was kept in prison, neglected, and eventually died at the age of 10. Revolutionary guards occasionally forced him to drink and curse his parents in public, because apparently, humiliating a child was considered good political theater. As for the two youngest, Sophie and Louis Joseph, they had already died of illness before the revolution reached its bloodiest stages. Which in a dark way, might have been a mercy. Common threads. So what do we notice here? When queens lost their heads, their children rarely had happy endings. Sometimes, like Elizabeth I or James VI, they managed to turn tragedy into opportunity. But far more often, they ended up as pawns, prisoners, or quietly erased. Royal children weren't judged by their innocence. They were judged by their usefulness, or their threat. A small child could represent a dangerous claim to the throne. A teenage girl could represent rival heirs through marriage. And so, the safest place for the offspring of an executed queen was usually nowhere at all. And with that, let's drift softly toward the next royal fiasco. Because while the fates of children are one kind of sadness, the dynastic inbreeding of European monarchs is a different kind of slow-motion disaster. Part 2, Did medieval people really believe in love potions? Hey everyone! If you're still awake, that's impressive. If you're already drifting, even better. Either way, let's slide gently into our next strange corner of history. Tonight's question is a soft and slightly embarrassing one. Did medieval people really believe in love potions? And the answer is, oh yes. They did. But not in the glittery fairy tale way you might imagine, with sparkling pink liquid that instantly makes a knight fall to his knees. No. Medieval love potions were more, shall we say, practical. A little messy. Often involving kitchen ingredients you'd rather not consume at bedtime. So let's wander slowly through this world of charms, herbs, and whispered spells. And see how people, 1,000 years ago, tried to bottle something as inconvenient as love. Love is a problem to be solved. In the Middle Ages, love was not seen as a whimsical joy. It was a problem. Something unpredictable, disruptive, and very often dangerous. Marriage wasn't about feelings. It was a business contract. A way to consolidate land, wealth, or political alliances. So if love inconveniently appeared where it wasn't supposed to, people reached for remedies, or for blame. A nobleman marries beneath his station? Obviously bewitched. A young wife dislikes her husband and refuses his bed? Surely under the influence of some malicious charm. And when an affair threatened to upset inheritance, the gossip always circled back to potions and sorcery. So the idea of the love potion was less about making romance bloom, and more about explaining why people made foolish choices. Because naturally, no one could simply fall for the wrong person. There had to be witchcraft involved. Recipes of desire. Now, what did these potions actually look like? Well, here's where it gets charmingly unappetizing. Herbal manuals of the time list dozens of plants believed to spark passion. Some were mild stimulants, like ginger, pepper, or saffron. Others were more symbolic than scientific. The root of a mandrake, shaped vaguely like a human body, was thought to stir lust. And dittany, an herb from Crete, was believed to warm the blood, though it mostly just helped with digestion. But medieval potions rarely stopped at herbs. They liked to get creative. One recipe instructed women to slip a drop of their menstrual blood into a man's drink. Another recommended grinding up the heart of a dove, for tenderness. In Italy, some young women were told to bake bread mixed with hair clippings from their beloved. And in more rural corners of Europe, there are references to toad parts, rooster testicles, and, alarmingly, powdered human bone. Because nothing says romance quite like sipping on liquefied skeleton. Of course, most of these would have had no actual effect, apart from making the victim violently ill. But belief is powerful. If someone thought they had been enchanted, their behavior often changed. And in a world where placebo was indistinguishable from magic, that was enough. Church disapproval with predictable drama. Naturally, the Church had very strong feelings about all this. And by strong feelings, I mean absolute panic. To theologians, love potions were not simply silly folk remedies. They were invitations to the devil himself. Medieval handbooks on witchcraft are full of warnings about women, always women, of course, using philters to ensnare unsuspecting men. It was easier to believe a man had been bewitched than to admit he might simply prefer the company of someone younger, prettier, or, heaven forbid, kinder than his lawful wife. Theologians love to collect horror stories about love charms gone wrong. They claim that men who drank them became permanently impotent. Or, alternatively, consumed with such violent lust that they died from exhaustion. Very dramatic outcomes, none of which were supported by evidence. But when you're writing a sermon, subtlety isn't the goal. Trials for witchcraft often included accusations of love magic. One of the earliest famous cases was Alice Kyteler, a wealthy Irish woman in the 1320s. She had been married 4 times, which was considered suspiciously successful. Her enemies accused her of using potions made from the intestines of cocks, dead men's fingernails, and powdered brains of unbaptized children. Whether or not she ever brewed such things is doubtful. But the accusation itself tells us just how firmly people believed in the idea. Royal scandals and whispered charms. Even the highborn weren't safe from gossip. Whenever a queen or noblewoman married against expectations, rumors of potions followed. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine. She married Louis VII of France, divorced him, and then married Henry II of England. Her second marriage was so politically powerful that people whispered she must have used sorcery. After all, how else could she convince Henry to marry her within just 8 weeks of her annulment? It couldn't possibly be because Eleanor was witty, wealthy, and politically brilliant. No, it had to be witchcraft. Centuries later, Mary, Queen of Scots, was accused of dabbling in charms to secure the affections of Lord Bothwell. This was probably slander. Her enemies needed a way to explain why she had run off with such an unsavory man. And of course, potion sounds more believable than she had terrible taste in husbands. Did they work? The more interesting question is not whether medieval people believed in potions, but whether they ever noticed that they didn't actually work. And the answer is complicated. Because sometimes, they did seem to. Not chemically, but psychologically. If a woman gave her husband a potion, whether it was spiced wine, sweetened milk, or just a pinch of something exotic, she might tell him it was a charm to make him love her. And if he believed her, he might act more affectionately. At least for a while. Expectation and suggestion were powerful forces. And occasionally, herbs chosen for symbolic reasons also had physiological side effects. Saffron really can act as a mild stimulant. Nutmeg can produce a sense of warmth. And alcohol, often used as the base of these potions, tends to lower inhibitions regardless of magical intent. So the line between magic and chemistry was blurry. But when things went wrong, when marriages collapsed, or men wandered off, or a child was born with an awkward resemblance to the neighbor, it was easier to blame sorcery than human behavior. A tender side. There is, however, a softer angle. Because not all potions were about control. Some were given out of desperation. Imagine a young woman married off to a much older husband who ignored her. Or a man pining after someone far above his station. In a world with little room for free romance, potions offered the illusion of agency. A way to try, however feebly, to steer the heart of another. In this sense, love charms were less about manipulation, and more about hope. They were the medieval equivalent of someone Googling how to text your crush at 2 in the morning. Clumsy, a little sad, but deeply human. The decline of the potion. By the Renaissance, love potions began to lose their hold on the imagination. Science and medicine were advancing. Alchemy shifted toward chemistry. And people slowly realized that powdered frog liver wasn't a reliable pathway to affection. But even as belief declined, the cultural memory lingered. Shakespeare joked about it. Fairy tales preserved it. And centuries later, we still talk about being enchanted or bewitched by love. Remnants of a time when passion was seen not as a natural impulse, but as a spell cast upon the unsuspecting. Drifting out. So did medieval people believe in love potions? Absolutely. To them, love was dangerous enough to require magic. And disappointing enough to explain away with sorcery when it went wrong. And while their recipes were often grotesque, and their accusations cruel, the underlying truth remains gentle. Even then, people longed to be loved. And when they couldn't find it naturally, they tried to stir it into a cup of wine, whisper over it, and hope. And with that, we can gently close the book on medieval love potions. Let's drift onward, next time, to another soft disaster of history. Perhaps to the most inbred monarchs of Europe, or to the sickly childhoods of royal heirs. Because there's never any shortage of dynastic misery to lull us to sleep. Part 3, Who were history's most dangerous female poisoners? Hey everyone! If you're still with me, thank you. If you've already drifted off, also thank you, because that's sort of the point. Tonight we're sliding into a question that is both unsettling and strangely soothing. Who were history's most dangerous female poisoners? Now, I know, poison isn't the most relaxing subject. But remember, we're in safe hands here. Nobody's slipping anything into your tea, unless you count chamomile. And really, the stories of female poisoners are less about gore, and more about quiet cunning. Because unlike battles, or duels, or other noisy ways of killing people, poisoning was discreet. It was about patience, secrecy, and usually, desperation. And because women in many eras had little access to swords or armies, poison became the rumor, the stereotype, and occasionally the reality, of female violence. So let's drift gently through history's darker kitchens, apothecaries, and court chambers. Where the most dangerous poisoners were not always the ones you'd expect. Lucrezia Borgia, the myth more than a woman. We'll start with a familiar name, Lucrezia Borgia. If you've heard of her, you've probably heard that she carried poison in a hollow ring. That she could flick her finger into a goblet of wine and doom a man before dessert. It's a wonderfully cinematic image. It is also almost certainly false. Lucrezia was the daughter of Pope Alexander VI, yes, a pope with children, because of course he was. The Borgias were infamous for corruption, nepotism, and scandal. And in the 16th century, everyone loved to imagine that their power came from sinister methods. So Lucrezia, young, beautiful, and politically useful, became the subject of endless slander. She was accused of incest with her father and brother, of sleeping with everyone else, and of killing rivals with poison. But in reality, there's no evidence she poisoned anyone. She spent much of her life as a respectable duchess in Ferrara, running her household, funding the arts, and trying to avoid the chaos of her family's reputation. Her supposed poison ring probably existed only in gossip. Still, the myth stuck, and Lucrezia Borgia became the archetype of the female poisoner. Not because she actually was one, but because people wanted her to be. Sometimes, the most dangerous poisoners are the ones invented by rumor. Caterina de' Medici, powdered inheritance. Now, if we want a woman with a more plausible connection to poison, let's drift over to France. To Catherine de' Medici. Queen consort, Queen mother, and the not-so-gentle matriarch of the French Wars of Religion. Catherine had a reputation for surrounding herself with astrologers, alchemists, and apothecaries. She was fascinated by perfumes, cosmetics, and powders. All perfectly normal for the Renaissance. But when your enemies are suspicious, perfume can easily be rebranded as arsenic in a vial. Catherine was blamed for many deaths. The most famous rumor was that she had a collection of poison gloves, delicate little accessories that could deliver death with a handshake. There's no real proof of this, but one suspicious incident lingers. In 1572, Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, died suddenly after purchasing gloves in Paris. And naturally, people whispered that Catherine had arranged it. Was it poison? Or just illness? Hard to say. But Catherine's reputation was set, the elegant Queen Mother, killing with invisible powders. Did she truly poison people? We can't prove it. But what matters is that her contemporaries thought she might. And in politics, fear is sometimes more effective than fact. Giulia Tofana, poison as a business model. Now, if you want a genuine poisoner, someone who actually did it, let's drift to 17th century Italy. To Giulia Tofana. Giulia was not a noblewoman, but an apothecary of sorts. And her specialty was aqua tofana. A clear, tasteless liquid. Usually a mixture of arsenic, lead, and belladonna. Sold discreetly to women who wanted to be free of inconvenient husbands. It was, in many ways, the perfect product. 3 or 4 drops stirred into soup or wine would kill a man gradually, over days. It looked like natural illness, a slow decline, with no obvious trace of foul play. And widows, conveniently, inherited property. Giulia's operation ran quietly for years. She supposedly helped hundreds of women across Italy become widows. She even sold her potion disguised in little vials marked as holy water, or sometimes in cosmetic jars, so it could sit innocently on a lady's dressing table. Eventually, of course, rumors spread. Authorities investigated. Giulia confessed under torture, claiming over 600 victims. Whether that number is true is doubtful. But even half of it would make her one of the most prolific poisoners in history. Unlike Lucrezia or Catherine, Giulia was not simply a rumor. She was the real thing. An entrepreneur of quiet death. The Marquise de Brinvilliers, Paris and Scandal. Let's drift next to France again. 17th century Paris. Where one woman's private crimes turned into a full-blown public panic. Marie-Madeleine d'Aubry, the Marquise de Brinvilliers, was married to a dull, inattentive husband. So naturally, she took a lover. And this lover introduced her to poison. Together, they tested their concoctions on hospital patients. Because what better laboratory than sick people who were already dying? Once satisfied, Marie used the poisons on her own father and brothers. All conveniently died, leaving her with more inheritance. But in 1675, the plot unraveled. Her lover was arrested, letters were discovered, and Marie was implicated. The trial was a sensation. Paris gossiped endlessly about wealthy women poisoning their families. And her execution, beheading, followed by burning, was meant as a public warning, but instead of calming fears, it inflamed them. Soon, any sudden death among the elite was attributed to poison. And this hysteria gave birth to the notorious affair of the poisons, in which dozens of women were accused of buying potions, powders, and charms from shady fortune-tellers. Some were guilty. Most were not. But the panic itself showed just how deeply the idea of female poisoners had sunk into the European imagination. Locusta of Rome, the emperor's chemist. Now let's drift even further back. To ancient Rome. Because the Romans, naturally, had their own infamous poisoner. Her name was Locusta. She lived in the 1st century AD, and she specialized in supplying deadly substances to the imperial family. Which was a dangerous clientele, but also a very profitable one. Locusta allegedly helped Agrippina the Younger poison her husband, the Emperor Claudius, to secure the throne for her son Nero. Later, she also assisted Nero himself in disposing of rivals. When a poison didn't work fast enough, Nero supposedly beat her with his fists and demanded she try harder. A terrible boss, but a steady customer. Locusta became so notorious that she was eventually executed after Nero's downfall. But for a while, she was essentially the court's official poisoner. A reminder that female poisoners weren't always acting alone in kitchens. Sometimes, they were state employees. Why poison? Now, let's drift gently back and ask, why poison? Why this particular method, so often linked to women? Partly, it was practical. Poisons could be slipped into food or drink without requiring physical strength. And in societies where women rarely had access to weapons or open power, subtlety was their only option. But partly, it was cultural. Men who died suddenly often wanted someone to blame. And blaming a woman, especially a wife, was easy. Even if she hadn't lifted a finger, suspicion clung to her. So the stereotype of the female poisoner reinforced itself, case after case. It's worth remembering that for every Julia Tofana, there were dozens of innocent women accused unfairly. Poison was the accusation of choice whenever a woman seemed too independent, too wealthy, or simply inconvenient. A drowsy conclusion. So who were history's most dangerous female poisoners? Some, like Julia Tofana and the Marquise de Brinvilliers, really did make a business of it. Others, like Lucrezia Borgia and Catherine de' Medici, were guilty mostly of being powerful women surrounded by rumors. And still others, like Locusta of Rome, were simply tools in the hands of ambitious men. The truth is, poison was never just about murder. It was about fear, control, and imagination. It was the invisible threat that haunted courts and kitchens alike. And tonight, as we drift toward sleep, we can leave those shadowy bottles behind. Because the only thing in your glass should be water, tea, or maybe a little warm milk. Nothing more sinister than that. Part 4, What did Roman slaves do when their masters weren't watching? Hey everyone! Welcome back, or perhaps welcome back from sleep. If you dozed off somewhere between Italian poisoners and the fall of Nero, that's perfectly fine. In fact, ideal. But if you're still with me, half awake, half drowsy, let's take a quiet little trip to Rome. And the question tonight is simple: what did Roman slaves do when their masters weren't watching? Because when we talk about ancient slavery, we usually focus on the brutal parts. The chains, the punishments, the endless labor. And those were, unfortunately, very real. But no system of control is perfect. Even in Rome, where slavery was built into daily life, slaves found little pockets of time, little cracks in the system, where they could breathe, or even scheme. So let's wander softly into their world. Not the official history of emperors and legions, but the quieter, hidden history of stolen moments. The Roman household, a stage full of eyes. First, a little scene setting. A wealthy Roman household, or domus, was like a stage. And the actors were the slaves. They poured the wine. They cooked the meals. They brushed the master's toga, scrubbed the mistress's jewelry, carried messages through the city, and ran errands for the children. Some slept in the house, on mats in the hallways. Others lived in cramped rooms tucked behind the kitchen. And because Rome was a culture obsessed with hierarchy, a master's honor depended on how many slaves he owned. The more servants bustling around him, the more important he seemed. Which meant there were always a lot of eyes, watching, listening, reporting. But even in that crowded, disciplined space, there were cracks. Moments when the master left the room. Moments when the mistress was asleep. Moments when orders had not yet arrived. And that's when the question becomes interesting. Small acts of resistance. What did slaves do when they weren't being watched? Well, sometimes they resisted. Not in grand, heroic uprisings like Spartacus. Those were rare, and usually ended badly. But in quieter ways. Slaves stole food. A little extra bread from the kitchen. A few olives tucked away for later. One Roman writer complained that slaves always seemed to be mysteriously well-fed, despite the rations given. Which is a polite way of saying, they were definitely snacking on the side. They also stole time. Instead of rushing an errand, a slave might dawdle in the forum, chatting with acquaintances. Or stretch out a simple delivery into an afternoon stroll. And because Rome was so crowded, so chaotic, who could really prove they weren't delayed by traffic? And then there were the little acts of sabotage. Breaking a dish by accident. Forgetting instructions just often enough to frustrate a master. The Roman playwright Plautus actually joked about this in his comedies. His slave characters often outsmarted their masters, tricking them with clever lies. Which tells us something. Even Romans knew, deep down, that control was never complete. Friendships and networks. When the master's back was turned, slaves also socialized. They formed little networks, whispering in kitchens, chatting in markets, and sharing news across households. We know from letters and graffiti that slaves sometimes had friendships that lasted years, even across different owners. Imagine carrying gossip from one villa to another. The masters thought they were in control, but beneath them ran an invisible web of communication, a society within a society. And these connections could be powerful. If a slave wanted to run away, or needed to borrow money, or hoped to plan a secret meeting, friends in other households were the lifeline. Masters rarely realized how much their information leaked through the servants' grapevine. Side hustles. Another thing slaves did when not being directly supervised: business. Yes, business. In Rome, it was common for slaves, especially skilled ones, to manage shops, workshops, or financial accounts on behalf of their masters. But in practice, this gave them a surprising amount of freedom. A slave might run a tavern, collect rent, or sell produce in the market. Technically, all profits belonged to the master. But in reality, most slaves skimmed a little extra. Sometimes with permission, a small reward for loyalty, and sometimes without. Over time, these side hustles could accumulate into a personal savings fund, called a peculium. And here's the interesting part, a peculium could eventually be used to buy a slave's freedom. So while a master imagined his servant was busy making money for him, the servant might also be quietly making money for themselves. The dream of freedom, tucked away in coins hidden under a bed. Religion and secret hopes. Another hidden activity was worship. Slaves were often allowed, even expected, to participate in their master's household rituals. But when left alone, they sometimes prayed to their own gods, or kept small charms from their homeland. Archaeologists have found little figurines, amulets, and graffiti invoking deities that weren't part of the official Roman pantheon. These were quiet acts of memory. A way of keeping identity alive in a world that tried to erase it. And some turned to new religions. Christianity, for instance, spread quickly among slaves in the first few centuries. Not because it promised instant freedom, but because it offered dignity. The idea that even the lowliest slave was equal before God was revolutionary. And masters often had no idea their servants were slipping off to secret meetings in back rooms at night. Love, intimacy, and stolen moments. What else happened when the masters weren't looking? Romance. Or at least, attempts at it. Slaves formed relationships with each other. Sometimes with free people. Sometimes even with their master's relatives, though that was dangerous. The poet Ovid joked about how slaves carried love letters between young aristocrats. But surely, they also wrote their own. A scratched piece of graffiti in Pompeii simply reads, "Successus loves Iris." Successus was a slave name. And Iris may have been one too. A fleeting little message, preserved in volcanic ash, reminding us that even in bondage, people longed for affection. Of course, these moments were risky. Slaves had no legal right to marry, and their relationships could be broken by sale or punishment. But still, when the masters weren't looking, they carved out what intimacy they could. Runaways. Finally, we can't forget escape. Not every slave dreamed of slipping away, the risks were enormous. But some tried. Roman walls carried inscriptions offering rewards for runaways. Descriptions of hair color, scars, even accents. And the penalties, if caught, could be brutal. Yet, despite all that, people kept trying. Sometimes they fled into the countryside, joining bandit groups. Sometimes they tried to blend into the city crowd. And sometimes they sought refuge in temples, hoping to claim sanctuary. Runaways were the ultimate expression of what slaves did when they weren't watched. They stopped being there at all. What this tells us. So what did Roman slaves do when their masters weren't watching? They stole food. They dawdled on errands. They whispered gossip. They built friendships, ran side businesses, prayed to forbidden gods, loved in secret, and occasionally, they ran. In other words, they lived. Not fully free. Not fully safe. But not entirely broken either. Even in the harshest systems, people carve out slivers of humanity. And when we think of Roman slavery, it's worth remembering those small moments. Because history often paints slaves as nameless masses, faceless laborers at the mercy of their masters. But in the quiet spaces, when nobody was looking, there were also cooks sneaking olives, lovers writing graffiti, and dreamers saving coins for freedom. Drifting out of Rome. And with that, let's leave the Roman household behind. The master has returned. The orders resume. The crack in the system closes, at least for now. But if you listen closely, You can almost hear the footsteps of a servant walking a little too slowly through the forum, stretching out their errand. Because when nobody's watching, even the smallest rebellion can feel like freedom.